She was called the she-wolf of France, a queen betrayed by her king, and a woman who dared to sleep with beasts, or so the legends say. But behind the scandal lies a story of power, rebellion, and revenge. Isabella of France didn't just survive the cruelty of a broken crown, she shattered it. Tonight, we unravel the dark rise of a queen who defied her fate and became one of the most feared women in medieval history. But before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you love stories that blend mystery, emotion, and cinematic truth, hit that subscribe button and join the journey. Now stay with us for a moment, because the crown is about to fall. Isabella of France was born in 1295 into the heart of medieval power, the Capetian dynasty, one of the most formidable royal houses in Europe. Her father, King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, ruled France with a cold, calculating hand. He was a monarch feared by his enemies and revered by his subjects, but within the walls of his court, warmth was scarce. Isabella's childhood unfolded in a world of rigid ceremony, political maneuvering, and silent expectations. Her mother, Queen Joan I of Navarre, died when Isabella was still young, leaving her to navigate the complexities of royal life without maternal guidance. From the beginning, Isabella was not raised to be loved. She was raised to be useful. As a royal daughter, Isabella's destiny was never her own. She was groomed to be a queen, not of France, but of England, a foreign land with foreign customs and a foreign king. Her education was steeped in diplomacy, etiquette, and the art of silence. She learned to read people's intentions behind their words, to mask her emotions behind a serene expression, and to endure discomfort with grace. Even as a child, she understood that her beauty was a weapon, her lineage a tool, and her voice something to be used sparingly. She was praised for her intelligence, her poise, and her striking appearance, porcelain skin, sapphire eyes, and a regal bearing that made her seem older than her years. In 1308, at the age of 12, Isabella was married to Edward IV of England. The marriage was a political alliance, designed to secure peace between France and England after years of tension. But while the treaty may have satisfied the ambitions of kings, it condemned Isabella to a life of emotional exile. Edward Sicra was not the husband she had been promised. Unlike his father, Edward I, a warrior king feared across Europe, Edward Sicra was passive, distracted, and emotionally unavailable. From the moment Isabella arrived in England, she sensed that her place in court would be far more precarious than she had imagined. Edward's heart belonged not to Isabella, but to another Piers Gaveston, a charismatic and flamboyant nobleman who had been Edward's companion since youth. Gaveston was everything Isabella was not, bold, brash, and unashamedly favoured. Edward showered him with titles, wealth, and influence, elevating him above the nobility and even above his own queen. At her coronation, Isabella was humiliated when Gaveston appeared dressed in royal finery, drawing more attention than the bride herself. The English barons were outraged, and Isabella's French relatives were insulted. But Edward was blind to the scandal. His devotion to Gaveston was absolute. Isabella, still a teenager, found herself trapped in a marriage where she was neither loved nor respected. Her role as queen was ceremonial, her voice ignored, her presence tolerated. She watched as Gaveston mocked the nobility, undermined her authority, and flaunted his closeness to the king. The court buzzed with rumours. Some whispered of an unnatural relationship between Edward and Gaveston. Others speculated that Isabella was being deliberately sidelined. But Isabella said nothing. She endured, she observed, and she waited. Her early years in England were marked by quiet suffering. She bore Edward's children, including the future Edward III, fulfilling her duty as queen and mother. But behind the scenes, she began to build alliances. She cultivated relationships with disaffected nobles, learned the intricacies of English politics, and kept close ties with her family in France. She was no longer the silent girl of her youth. She was becoming something else, something sharper, something more dangerous. When Gaveston was eventually exiled and later executed by rebellious barons, Isabella's position improved slightly. But the void left by Gaveston was soon filled by another Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was more ruthless than Gaveston, more ambitious, and far more dangerous. He manipulated Edward, seized lands, and crushed opposition. Once again, Isabella was pushed aside. Her estates were confiscated, her allies imprisoned, and her influence diminished. She was treated not as a queen, but as a threat. Yet Isabella did not break. She adapted, she learned, and she began to plan. Edward of England was a king born into greatness but seemingly allergic to it, the son of Edward I, a towering figure in medieval warfare and governance. Edward inherited a kingdom that expected strength, decisiveness, and honor. Instead, it received a monarch more interested in music than military, in personal companionship than political strategy. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1307, Edward's reign was marked by confusion, favoritism, and scandal, and at the center of it all stood one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was no ordinary courtier. He was flamboyant, witty, and dangerously charming. He had been Edward's companion since youth, and their bond was so intense that many questioned its nature. Whether their relationship was romantic, platonic, or something in between, one thing was clear. Edward adored Gaveston with a devotion that eclipsed all others, including his own wife, Queen Isabella. Gaveston was elevated to the rank of Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty. He was showered with gifts, lands, and influence, while the English barons seethed with resentment. Gaveston mocked them openly, calling them names, ridiculing their traditions, and flaunting his power. Isabella, newly arrived from France and barely in her teens, watched this spectacle unfold with growing horror. Her marriage to Edward had already been a disappointment. She had expected a king, a partner, a protector. Instead, she found herself married to a man who barely acknowledged her presence, who preferred the company of Gaveston, and who seemed oblivious to the damage his favoritism was causing. At her coronation, Gaveston wore garments more lavish than the Queen herself, drawing whispers and outrage. Isabella's French relatives were insulted, and the English nobility saw it as a national disgrace. Yet Edward remained unmoved. His loyalty to Gaveston was unshakable. Isabella's position at court became increasingly precarious. She was the queen in name, but Gaveston was the true consort in practice. Her voice was ignored, her counsel dismissed, and her dignity eroded. She was forced to play the role of the silent observer, watching as her husband's obsession with Gaveston destabilized the realm. The barons, furious at Gaveston's influence, demanded his exile. Edward reluctantly agreed, only to recall Gaveston shortly after. This cycle repeated itself, each time deepening the rift between the crown and the nobility. Eventually, the barons took matters into their own hands. In 1312, Gaveston was captured and executed by a group of rebellious nobles. His death was brutal, a public statement that the king's favoritism would no longer be tolerated. Edward was devastated. He mourned Gaveston deeply, and his grief turned to bitterness. But instead of learning from the loss, Edward sought a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was a different breed. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and reckless, Despenser was calculating and cruel. He quickly became Edward's closest advisor, manipulating the king and consolidating power. Despenser seized lands, imprisoned rivals, and ruled with an iron fist. Isabella, who had hoped Gaveston's death might restore balance to the court, found herself once again sidelined, this time by a man far more dangerous. Despenser's rise marked a new chapter of humiliation for Isabella. Her lands were confiscated, her allies were targeted, and her influence was systematically dismantled. She was treated not as a queen, but as a political liability. Despenser viewed her with suspicion, and Edward, under Despenser's sway, grew increasingly cold. Isabella's isolation deepened. She was watched, restricted, and silenced. Yet Isabella was no longer the naive girl who had arrived from France. She had learned the language of power, the art of survival, and the value of patience. She began to cultivate quiet alliances, reaching out to nobles disillusioned by Despenser's tyranny. She maintained correspondence with her family in France, keeping diplomatic channels open. She studied Despenser's methods, his weaknesses, and his enemies. She waited. The court, meanwhile, descended into chaos. Despenser's greed knew no bounds. He seized lands from widows, manipulated legal systems, and provoked rebellion. The barons, once again enraged, rose up in revolt. Civil unrest spread across England. Edward and Despenser responded with brutal repression, executing dissenters and tightening their grip. Isabella, trapped in this storm, endured in silence, but her fury was growing. Her marriage had become a prison. Her husband was a stranger. Her crown was ornamental, and her dignity had been stripped away by men who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. But beneath the surface, Isabella was transforming. She was no longer the passive queen. She was becoming something else, something sharper, colder, and more dangerous. The rumors began to swirl. Whispers of Isabella's discontent, of her secret communications, of her growing defiance. She began to refuse certain ceremonial duties. She withdrew from court functions. She made subtle but deliberate gestures of resistance. Despenser noticed, Edward noticed, but neither understood the depth of her resolve. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, a seemingly routine task. But it was there, away from the suffocating grip of Despenser and Edward, that Isabella began to plot her rebellion. She met Roger Mortimer, a powerful noble in exile, and their alliance would soon shake the foundations of the English crown. For now, though, Isabella remained the queen who had been betrayed, humiliated, and silenced. But she was no longer waiting. She was preparing. Isabella's descent into political and emotional captivity began not with chains, but with silence. After the death of Piers Gaveston, many believed the Queen's suffering might ease. But the void Gaveston left was quickly filled by a far more dangerous figure, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unlike Gaveston, Despenser was not flamboyant or reckless. He was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. His rise to power marked the beginning of Isabella's darkest years, a time when her crown became a cage and her palace a prison. Despencer's influence over Edward II grew rapidly. He didn't just advise the king, he controlled him. Through manipulation, flattery, and fear, Despencer became the shadow ruler of England. He seized lands from nobles, rewrote laws to benefit his allies, and punished anyone who dared oppose him. His greed was insatiable, and his cruelty knew no bounds. The English barons, already wary from Gaveston's reign, were now faced with a tyrant who operated with royal backing. Rebellions flared across the country, but Edward and Despencer crushed them with brutal efficiency. Isabella, once again, found herself pushed to the margins. Her royal estates were confiscated and handed to Despencer's allies. Her household was infiltrated by spies loyal to the Despencer regime. Her movements were monitored, her letters intercepted, and her allies imprisoned or exiled. She was no longer just ignored, she was actively suppressed. The Queen of England had become a political hostage. But Despencer's cruelty wasn't limited to politics. He humiliated Isabella in personal, calculated ways. He ensured she was excluded from council meetings, denied access to funds, and stripped of ceremonial honours. At court, she was treated with icy disdain. Her servants were replaced with Despencer loyalists. Her chambers were searched. Even her wardrobe was restricted. Every aspect of her life was controlled, and every gesture of defiance was punished. Edward, under Despencer's influence, became increasingly paranoid and detached. He viewed Isabella not as a partner, but as a threat. Their marriage, already strained, deteriorated into cold hostility. Edward refused to listen to her counsel, dismissed her concerns, and sided with Despencer in every dispute. Isabella's role as queen consort was reduced to mere symbolism. She was expected to smile, to appear at ceremonies, and to bear children, nothing more. Yet Isabella did not break. She endured, she adapted. She began to study Despencer's methods, his alliances, and his enemies. She listened carefully, spoke sparingly, and observed everything. She understood that open rebellion would be suicide, but quiet resistance, that was possible. She began to rebuild her network in secret, reaching out to nobles who had lost lands to Despencer, to clerics who resented his interference, and to foreign diplomats who saw opportunity in England's instability. Her relationship with her son, Edward III, became a lifeline. She poured her hopes into him, teaching him the values of justice, strength, and loyalty, everything his father had failed to embody. She knew that one day he would be king, and when that day came, she wanted him to remember the suffering she endured and the strength she showed. In 1322, Despencer's tyranny reached new heights. After crushing a major rebellion led by Thomas of Lancaster, Edward and Despencer enacted a wave of purges. Nobles were executed, lands were seized, and dissent was silenced. Isabella watched as friends and allies were dragged from their homes, tried in sham courts, and hanged. The message was clear: opposition would not be tolerated. Isabella's own position became even more precarious. She was accused of sympathizing with rebels, of harboring traitors, and of plotting against the crown. Though no formal charges were brought, the threat loomed constantly. She was isolated, her correspondence restricted, and her access to her son limited. She was a queen in name only, a prisoner in velvet robes. But even in captivity, Isabella's resolve hardened. She began to think not just of survival, but of revenge. She remembered her father's cold brilliance, her mother's quiet strength, and her own years of silent endurance. She began to imagine a different future, one where she was not the victim, but the architect, one where Despencer would fall, and Edward would be dethroned, one where she would reclaim her dignity, her power, and her voice. In 1325, a diplomatic opportunity arose. England needed to negotiate with France over disputed territories. Edward, reluctant to leave the country, sent Isabella in his place. It was a calculated risk. She was still queen, and her French heritage made her a suitable envoy. But Edward and Despencer believed she was broken, incapable of rebellion. They underestimated her. Isabella arrived in France with grace and poise, but beneath her calm exterior, she was already plotting. Away from Despencer's grip, she reconnected with her brother, King Charles IV of France. She began to gather support, both political and military. And then she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had fled Despencer's wrath and was living in exile. Their meeting was electric. Mortimer was bold, charismatic, and deeply opposed to Despencer. Isabella saw in him not just an ally, but a partner. Their alliance quickly deepened into intimacy. Rumors swirled of a romantic affair, of whispered plans and secret meetings. Whether their bond was born of love, ambition, or shared pain, it became the foundation of a rebellion that would shake England to its core. Isabella, once the silenced queen, was now the leader of a movement. She had endured humiliation, captivity, and betrayal, but she had never surrendered. Back in England, Despencer and Edward grew suspicious. They demanded Isabella return. She refused. She declared that she would not return until Despencer was removed from power. It was a bold, unprecedented act of defiance. The Queen had spoken, and her voice echoed across Europe. Isabella's captivity had forged her into something new. She was no longer the girl who had been married off at 12, nor the queen who had been humiliated at court. She was a strategist, a rebel, and a mother determined to protect her son's future. The chains that had bound her were broken, and the reckoning was coming. Isabella's departure from England in 1325 was framed as a diplomatic mission, a gesture of goodwill between two royal siblings, Isabella, Queen of England, and Charles IV, King of France. But beneath the surface, it was an escape, a calculated move to break free from the suffocating grip of Hugh Despenser and the increasingly paranoid Edward II. For years, Isabella had endured humiliation, isolation, and political erasure. Now on French soil, she was no longer a prisoner. She was a queen with agency, and she was ready to act. In Paris, Isabella was welcomed with honor. Her brother Charles IV treated her with respect, granting her the dignity she had been denied in England. But Isabella was not there to bask in ceremony. She had a mission, to build an alliance strong enough to challenge the English crown. She began by securing her son, the young Edward II, who had been sent to France to pay homage to his uncle. Isabella refused to send him back. She declared that England was no longer safe for her son, a bold accusation that signalled her break with Edward II. This act alone was revolutionary. A queen consort had never openly defied her king in such a public and political way. Isabella's refusal to return, her retention of the heir to the throne, and her demand for Despenser's removal sent shockwaves through Europe. Edward C. was furious. He sent envoys, threats, and pleas. Isabella ignored them. She was no longer negotiating, she was preparing for war. It was during this time that she met Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had once been a powerful noble in England, but after opposing Despenser, he had been imprisoned in the Tower of London. His escape was legendary. He fled to France, where he lived in exile, nursing his hatred for Despenser and Edward. When Isabella met him, their connection was immediate. Both had suffered under Despenser's tyranny. Both had lost power, dignity, and freedom, and both were determined to reclaim it. Their alliance quickly deepened. Mortimer was charismatic, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. Isabella saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood the stakes, the risks, and the need for secrecy. Together, they began to plot an invasion. They gathered support from exiled English nobles, disaffected French lords, and mercenaries willing to fight for coin and cause. Isabella used her royal status to secure funding, ships, and safe passage. Mortimer handled the military logistics. It was a partnership forged in desperation, but fueled by vision. Rumors of their relationship spread quickly. Chronicles from the time, and later historians, speculated about the nature of their bond. Some claimed they were lovers, others accused them of dark rituals and manipulative seduction. The phrase "slept with beasts" emerged from this swirl of scandal, painting Isabella as a woman who had traded her virtue for power. But the truth was more complex. Isabella had been betrayed, silenced, and stripped of agency. Her alliance with Mortimer was not just romantic, it was revolutionary. She was reclaiming her voice, her crown, and her legacy. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion. They landed in Suffolk with a modest force, but their arrival ignited a firestorm. The English people, wary of Despenser's cruelty and Edward's weakness, rallied to their cause. Nobles defected, towns opened their gates. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Isabella, once the silenced queen, was now the face of resistance. She rode through England with her son at her side, greeted not with suspicion, but with cheers. Edward, Harry, and Despenser panicked. They fled west, hoping to regroup and resist, but their support was crumbling. Isabella's forces pursued them relentlessly. In November, Despenser was captured. His execution was brutal, a public spectacle meant to symbolize the end of tyranny. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body desecrated as crowds jeered. Isabella watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. The man who had stolen her lands, humiliated her, and imprisoned her allies was gone. Edward Ali was captured shortly after. He was stripped of his crown and imprisoned. Isabella did not order his death, but she ensured he would never rule again. His fate remains one of history's mysteries. Some say he was murdered in captivity, others claim he lived out his days in secret exile. But for Isabella, the goal had been achieved. The tyrants were gone. The crown was in her hands. She installed her son Edward III as king. But he was still a teenager, and Isabella declared herself regent. Mortimer, now her closest advisor, wielded immense power. Together, they ruled England, not as monarchs, but as architects of a new order. Their reign was marked by reform, consolidation, and a lingering sense of unease. Isabella had won, but the cost was high. She had defied tradition, shattered expectations, and rewritten the role of queen. She was no longer just a consort. She was a ruler. Yet victory did not bring peace. Whispers of scandal followed her everywhere. The church condemned her rebellion. Nobles resented Mortimer's influence, and Edward III, growing older and more confident, began to question the power dynamics of his own court. Isabella had risen from silence to sovereignty, but the storm was far from over. The alliance between Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer was more than political. It was incendiary. After years of humiliation and suppression under Hugh Despencer and Edward T., Isabella had transformed from a silenced queen into a calculating rebel. Her partnership with Mortimer, forged in exile and rebellion, became the fulcrum of her rise to power. But with that rise came scandal, whispers, and a legacy stained by one haunting question: had the Queen of England truly slept with beasts? The phrase itself, slept with beasts, was born not from fact but from fear. It was a weapon wielded by chroniclers and enemies who could not comprehend a woman taking power so boldly, so unapologetically. In medieval England, queens were meant to be passive, pious, and obedient. Isabella shattered that mold. She defied her husband, took a lover, raised an army, and overthrew the crown. To many, she was not a queen, she was a monster. And so, the myth was born. Roger Mortimer was no beast in the literal sense, but to Isabella's enemies, he might as well have been. He was a traitor, a fugitive, and a man who had dared to share power with a woman. Their relationship, whether romantic or strategic, became the centerpiece of a national scandal. Chronicles accused Isabella of lust, manipulation, and moral decay. They painted Mortimer as her seducer, her puppet master, her dark shadow. Together they were cast as the embodiment of sin, an unnatural union that defied God and crown. But behind the myth was a story of survival. Isabella had endured years of emotional exile, political erasure, and personal humiliation. Her marriage to Edward Doy had been a cold arrangement, devoid of affection and riddled with betrayal. She had watched her lands stolen, her allies imprisoned, and her dignity stripped away. Mortimer, too, had suffered. He had been imprisoned, exiled, and hunted. Their bond was not born of lust. It was born of shared pain, shared ambition, and a shared vision for a different England. After their successful invasion in 1326, Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents for the young Edward III. Though the boy was crowned king, real power rested in their hands. Mortimer was granted titles, lands, and influence. Isabella reclaimed her estates, her status, and her voice. Together they governed with precision and authority, but their rule was not without controversy. Mortimer's rise was meteoric. He became Earl of March, controlled royal finances, and commanded military forces. His enemies accused him of arrogance, corruption, and tyranny. Isabella, once hailed as a liberator, was now seen as complicit. The court buzzed with rumors of secret meetings, lavish feasts, and whispered commands. The line between queen and consort blurred. Mortimer was not king, but he acted like one. And Isabella, once the symbol of resistance, became the symbol of excess. Their relationship, whatever its true nature, became a lightning rod. The church condemned it, nobles resented it, and Edward growing older and more aware, began to question it. He saw Mortimer's power overshadowing his own. He saw his mother's authority challenged by scandal, and he began to plot his own rise. But for a time, Isabella and Mortimer ruled unchallenged. They restructured the government, restored order, and punished the remnants of Despencer's regime. They were efficient, strategic, and ruthless, yet the shadow of their alliance loomed large. Every decision was scrutinized. Every gesture was interpreted. Isabella's legacy, once heroic, became controversial. The myth of the Wolf of France took root during this period. Chroniclers, many loyal to the old regime or hostile to female power, began to rewrite her story. They emphasized her rebellion, her affair, and her defiance. They ignored her suffering, her courage, and her strategic brilliance. She became a cautionary tale, a queen who had dared too much, loved too boldly, and ruled too fiercely. The phrase "slept with beasts" was not just about Mortimer. It was about power. It was about a woman who had refused to be silent, who had taken control of her destiny, and who had paid the price. In a world where female ambition was feared, Isabella became the embodiment of that fear. Her enemies needed a way to discredit her, to reduce her to scandal, and so they did. But Isabella was not broken by the rumors. She continued to govern, to protect her son's throne, and to shape England's future. She knew the cost of power. She had lived it, and she accepted it. Her relationship with Mortimer, whatever its truth, was a part of that cost. She had chosen alliance over isolation, strategy over submission, and she had won, at least for a time. Yet the storm was gathering. Edward III, now 17, was no longer content to be a figurehead. He saw the resentment growing, the whispers multiplying, and the opportunity rising. He began to build his own alliances, to test his authority, and to prepare for a reckoning. Isabella, perhaps sensing the shift, tried to maintain control, but the tide was turning. In 1330, Edward III struck. He arrested Mortimer in a surprise coup, executed him for treason, and stripped Isabella of her regency. She was spared death, but her power was gone. She was sent into quiet exile, her voice once again silenced. The queen who had defied kings, raised armies, and rewritten history was now a shadow of her former self. But the myth endured, the scandal endured, and the question endured. Did Isabella truly sleep with beasts, or was she simply a woman who refused to be caged? History may never answer that question, but her story, raw, complex, and unforgettable, continues to echo through time. The year was 1326, and England stood on the edge of transformation. Isabella of France, once the silenced queen, had returned from exile not as a consort but as a conqueror. With Roger Mortimer by her side and her son Edward III in tow, she led an invasion that would dismantle the corrupt regime of Hugh Despencer and dethrone her husband, King Edward II. What followed was not just a rebellion, it was a reckoning. The Queen's revenge was swift, brutal, and unforgettable. Their landing in Suffolk was modest, but the impact was seismic. Isabella and Mortimer arrived with a small force, yet their presence ignited a wave of support across the kingdom. Nobles who had suffered under Despencer's tyranny rallied to their cause. Towns opened their gates. Clergy offered blessings. The people, wary of Edward's weakness and Despencer's cruelty, saw in Isabella a symbol of justice and strength. She was no longer the passive queen. They called her the savior of England. Edward, Ciran and Despencer fled west, desperate to regroup and resist, but their support was crumbling. Isabella's forces grew daily, swelling with defectors and loyalists. Her march across England was not just military, it was theatrical. She rode with dignity, her son beside her, her banners flying. Each town she entered was a stage, each speech a decoration. She was reclaiming her crown not through inheritance but through force. In November, the rebellion reached its climax. Despencer was captured near Llantrisant in Wales. His fate was sealed. Isabella, who had watched him strip her of lands, allies, and dignity, now held the power to decide his end. The execution was designed to send a message. Despencer was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors. His body was mutilated, his remains scattered. It was not just justice, it was vengeance. Edward II was captured shortly after. He was taken to Kenilworth Castle, stripped of his royal insignia, and imprisoned. Isabella did not order his death, but she ensured he would never rule again. In January 1327, Parliament declared him unfit to govern. He was forced to abdicate in favour of his son Edward III. The crown passed from father to son, but the power remained in Isabella's hands. The Queen's revenge was complete. She had overthrown her husband, executed his favourite, and installed her son as king. But her rule was far from symbolic. Edward III was only 14, and Isabella declared herself regent. Mortimer, now Earl of March, became her chief advisor. Together, they governed England with precision and authority. Their regime was marked by reform, restoration, and a lingering sense of fear. Isabella reclaimed her estates, restored her allies, and restructured the royal court. She rewarded those who had supported her and punished those who had resisted. Mortimer, ambitious and shrewd, consolidated his power. He controlled royal finances, military appointments, and foreign policy. His influence was vast, and his enemies grew restless. The nobility, once united in rebellion, began to fracture under his dominance. Despite the political tension, Isabella remained composed. She had endured humiliation, captivity, and betrayal. Now, she ruled with clarity and resolve. Her decisions were strategic, her demeanor regal. She attended council meetings, issued proclamations, and maintained diplomatic relations. She was not a puppet queen. She was a sovereign in all but name. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The court buzzed with rumors of excess, favoritism, and scandal. Mortimer's arrogance alienated key nobles. His rapid rise, coupled with his intimate relationship with Isabella, fueled resentment. The church expressed concern. Foreign ambassadors whispered of instability, and Edward III, growing older and more aware, began to question the power dynamics around him. Isabella's relationship with her son became increasingly strained. She had protected him, educated him, and placed him on the throne. But now, he was beginning to assert his own authority. He saw Mortimer's dominance as a threat to his sovereignty. He watched as decisions were made without his input, as his mother and Mortimer ruled in his name. The boy king was becoming a man, and he wanted control. In 1328, tensions escalated. Mortimer negotiated a controversial peace treaty with Scotland, ceding lands and titles. The nobility erupted in outrage. Edward III, though still under Isabella's regency, began to gather support. He formed alliances with disaffected lords, consulted with clerics, and plotted quietly. Isabella, perhaps sensing this shift, tried to maintain unity, but the tide was turning. By 1330, Edward III was ready. In a daring coup at Nottingham Castle, he arrested Mortimer during a secret council meeting. The operation was swift and surgical. Mortimer was taken to the Tower of London, tried for treason, and executed. His death was not as brutal as Despencer's, but it was final. The man who had helped Isabella rise was gone. Isabella herself was spared. Edward III, though angry and determined, did not punish his mother with death. Instead, he stripped her of power and sent her into quiet exile. She lived out her remaining years at Castle Rising, surrounded by luxury but far from influence. Her reign was over, her revenge complete, her legacy complicated. The queen who had defied kings, raised armies, and rewritten history was now a figure of reflection. Some saw her as a hero, others as a villain, but none could deny her impact. Isabella had changed England. She had challenged the norms of queenship, redefined female power, and left behind a story that would echo through centuries. Her revenge was not just personal, it was political, cultural, and symbolic. She had avenged her suffering, reclaimed her dignity, and reshaped the monarchy. But in doing so, she had also invited scandal, provoked fear, and paid a price. The crown she had seized was heavy, and the silence that followed was profound. With Edward III dethroned and Hugh Despenser executed, Isabella of France stood at the pinnacle of her power. England had been reshaped by her rebellion, and her son Edward III was crowned king in 1327. But at just 14 years old, he was too young to rule independently. Isabella, now regent, governed in his name, alongside her closest ally and rumoured lover, Roger Mortimer. Together, they held the reins of a kingdom still reeling from upheaval. Isabella's regency began with promise. She restored lands to nobles who had suffered under Despenser, stabilised the treasury, and negotiated peace with Scotland. Her rule was pragmatic and politically astute. Mortimer, elevated to Earl of March, became the most powerful man in England. He controlled military appointments, oversaw justice, and influenced foreign policy. But his rapid ascent bred resentment. Nobles who had supported Isabella's rebellion now feared Mortimer's unchecked authority. Whispers of corruption and arrogance spread through court. Isabella, once the symbol of resistance, now faced growing scrutiny. Her relationship with Mortimer, whether romantic or strategic, was viewed with suspicion. The church disapproved. Chroniclers painted her as a manipulative seductress, echoing the she-wolf myth that had begun to take root. Her enemies accused her of ruling through desire rather than wisdom. Yet Isabella remained composed, issuing decrees, attending councils, and maintaining diplomatic ties. She had fought too hard to be dismissed. Meanwhile, Edward III matured quickly. He observed the court's dynamics, Mortimer's dominance, and his mother's fading influence. Though publicly obedient, he quietly built alliances with nobles disillusioned by Mortimer's rule. He understood that true kingship required more than a crown. It required control. By 1330, at age 17, Edward was ready to act. In a bold move, Edward orchestrated a coup at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was arrested and charged with treason. Isabella, stunned and powerless to intervene, watched as her partner was executed. The boy she had protected and empowered had seized control. Her regency was over. Edward spared his mother's life, but stripped her of authority. Isabella was sent to Castle Rising, where she lived in quiet exile. Though treated with respect, she was no longer a political force. Her reign had ended not with a battle, but with a son's assertion of sovereignty. Isabella's time as regent was brief but transformative. She had ruled England, defied tradition, and reshaped the monarchy. Yet her partnership with Mortimer, once her strength, became her undoing. The queen who had risen through rebellion now fell through scandal. Still, her legacy endured, a woman who dared to wield power in a world that feared it. The fall of Roger Mortimer in 1330 marked a dramatic turning point in Isabella of France's life. Once the most powerful woman in England, she now stood stripped of influence, her authority dissolved by the very son she had placed on the throne. Edward III's coup at Nottingham Castle was swift and decisive. Mortimer was captured, tried for treason, and executed. Isabella, though spared the same fate, was politically dismantled. Her regency was over, and her voice silenced once more. Edward III's actions were calculated. He had watched Mortimer dominate court politics, overshadow the crown, and rule with unchecked ambition. Though Isabella had been the face of rebellion, Mortimer had become its engine and its liability. Edward's decision to remove him was not just about power, it was about reclaiming legitimacy. By executing Mortimer and sidelining Isabella, Edward signalled the beginning of his independent reign. Isabella was sent to Castle Rising in Norfolk, a luxurious estate far from the political heart of England. It was not a prison, but it was exile. She lived in comfort, surrounded by attendants and wealth, but cut off from governance. Her days of issuing decrees, negotiating treaties, and shaping policy were gone. The queen who had once marched through England with an army now walked gardens in solitude. Her relationship with Edward III remained complex. He did not publicly shame her, nor did he erase her contributions. She was treated with respect, given a generous allowance, and occasionally visited by family. But she was no longer a player in the game of power. Her role had shifted from ruler to relic, a living reminder of a turbulent past. Isabella's fall was not just political, it was emotional. She had risked everything to overthrow Edward II, endured scandal for her alliance with Mortimer, and ruled with vision and resolve. But in the end, she was undone by the very forces she had unleashed. Her son's rise meant her eclipse. The crown she had fought to protect now belonged to someone else. Yet Isabella did not fade into bitterness. In her later years, she turned inward, embracing religion, reflection, and quiet dignity. she remained proud, composed, and enigmatic. Visitors described her as regal, intelligent, and serene. She never publicly defended her actions, nor did she seek redemption. She simply lived, watching the kingdom she had once ruled evolve under her son's command. Chapter 8 closes not with vengeance or tragedy, but with quiet reckoning. Isabella's fall was not a collapse. It was a retreat. She had played her part, shaped her era, and paid the price. And though history would debate her legacy, she remained, until the end, a queen who had dared to defy. Isabella of France spent her final decades in quiet isolation at Castle Rising, far from the political storm she once commanded. The woman who had orchestrated a rebellion, dethroned a king, and ruled a kingdom now lived behind stone walls, surrounded by gardens, tapestries, and memories. Her exile was not harsh. Edward had ensured she lived in comfort, but it was absolute. She was no longer a queen in power, but a mother, a widow, and a symbol of a bygone era. In her solitude, Isabella turned inward. She embraced religion, attended mass regularly, and surrounded herself with clerics and ladies in waiting. Her days were filled with prayer, reading, and reflection. The fire that had once driven her rebellion now flickered quietly. She rarely spoke of Mortimer, never publicly defended her actions, and made no attempt to return to court. It was as if she had accepted her fate, not as punishment, but as closure. Yet the emotional toll of her journey lingered. Isabella had lived through betrayal, humiliation, and scandal. She had loved fiercely, fought boldly, and lost deeply. Her marriage to Edward Ty had been a cold alliance, her partnership with Mortimer a dangerous gamble. She had seen allies executed, enemies rise, and her own son seize power. These memories haunted her, even as she aged with grace. Occasionally, Isabella received visits from Edward III. Their relationship, though strained by history, remained respectful. Edward never condemned her publicly, and she never challenged his authority. In private, they spoke as mother and son, two monarchs who had once shared a throne, now separated by time and consequence. These visits were brief but meaningful. They reminded Isabella that her legacy lived on, even if her reign had ended. Outside Castle Rising, the myth of Isabella grew. Chroniclers called her the she-wolf of France, painting her as a seductress, a traitor, a queen who had dared too much. They exaggerated her affair with Mortimer, vilified her rebellion, and questioned her morality. But others saw her differently, as a woman who had fought for justice, defied tyranny, and reshaped the monarchy. Her story became legend, her image both feared and admired. Isabella died in 1358, at the age of 63. She was buried with honor at the Franciscan Church in London, her heart interred separately, a medieval symbol of love and loss. Her death marked the end of one of the most dramatic lives in English history. She left behind a kingdom transformed, a son who became one of England's greatest kings, and a legacy that refused to be forgotten. Chapter 9 is a lament, not of defeat, but of reflection. Isabella's final years were quiet, but her impact was thunderous. She had lived as a queen, ruled as a rebel, and endured as a woman who refused to be silenced. Her story, like her spirit, lingered long after her voice was gone. History rarely offers clean endings, and Isabella of France's story is no exception. Chapter 10 is not just a conclusion, it's a reckoning with myth, memory, and the blurred lines between scandal and survival. Isabella's life was a tapestry woven from betrayal, ambition, rebellion, and resilience. She was a daughter of kings, a queen of England, a mother to one of its greatest rulers, and a woman who dared to seize power in a world built to deny it. After her death in 1358, chroniclers rushed to define her legacy. Some called her a sheep-wolf, a seductress who toppled a king and corrupted a court. Others saw her as a tragic heroine, a queen forced to navigate a cruel marriage, political exile, and the treacherous terrain of medieval power. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Isabella's rebellion was not born of lust. It was born of necessity. Her marriage to Edward was a cold alliance, marked by neglect and humiliation. She watched as Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer consumed her husband's attention and dismantled her influence. She endured the theft of her lands, the imprisonment of her allies, and the erosion of her dignity, and when diplomacy failed, she chose defiance. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer was scandalous, yes, but it was also strategic. Together, they overthrew a corrupt regime, restored order, and placed her son on the throne. For a brief moment, Isabella ruled England not as a consort, but as a sovereign. She wielded power with precision, governed with clarity, and reshaped the monarchy. But power, especially for a woman in the 14th century, came at a cost. Mortimer's arrogance and ambition led to their downfall. Edward III, growing into his role, saw the danger and acted. Mortimer was executed, Isabella exiled, yet Edward spared his mother's life, a gesture that spoke to the complexity of their bond. She had given him the crown, and he had taken it back. Their story was not one of hatred, but of transition from one era to another. In her final years, Isabella lived quietly, surrounded by luxury but far from influence. She embraced religion, reflected on her past, and maintained a quiet dignity. She never publicly defended her choices, nor did she seek redemption. She simply endured, as she always had. And so, the question remains, was Isabella a villain or a visionary? A queen who slept with beasts, or a woman who refused to be caged? The answer is not found in chronicles or accusations. It's found in the echoes of her story, in the courage it took to rebel, the pain she carried, and the legacy she left behind. Isabella of France was not perfect, but she was powerful, and in a world that feared powerful women, she became unforgettable. Her story ends not with silence, but with resonance. A queen who defied her fate, rewrote her role, and dared to rule. The crown she wore was heavy, the path she chose was perilous, but she walked it with fire in her heart, and that fire still flickers in the pages of history.